The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky as Agent David Chen drove through the quiet roads of Millbrook County. He'd been on the road for almost 3 hours, heading to interview a witness for a federal fraud case he'd been working on for months. The rental car hummed steadily beneath him as he passed fields and old farmhouses. David was still wearing his dark suit from the court hearing earlier that morning. His FBI credentials sat in the passenger seat next to his briefcase. It had been a long day, and he was looking forward to finishing this interview and getting back home to his family. He noticed the police car behind him, but didn't think much of it at first. Just a local officer on patrol, probably heading in the same direction. But then the lights came on, flashing red and blue in his rearview mirror. David's heart sank a little. He quickly ran through everything in his mind. He wasn't speeding. He'd been careful about that, always was in unfamiliar areas. His seatbelt was on. What could it be? He pulled over to the side of the road, his tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. The police car stopped behind him, and David could see the officer sitting there for a moment, probably running his plates. David reached over and carefully placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen. This wasn't his first time being pulled over. As an Asian American man who often worked in different parts of the country, he'd learned to be extra careful during traffic stops. He kept his movements slow and predictable. The officer finally got out of his car. Through the side mirror, David could see him approaching. The officer was a white man, probably in his mid-30s, with a buzz cut and mirrored sunglasses. His hand rested casually on his belt as he walked up to the driver's side window. David rolled down the window and kept his hands visible on the wheel. "License and registration," the officer said flatly. "No greeting, no explanation for the stop." "Officer, I'm actually a federal agent," David said calmly. "I'm going to slowly reach for my credentials in the passenger seat." "Is that okay?" The officer's jaw tightened. "I said license and registration, now." David felt a small knot forming in his stomach. Something felt off about this whole interaction. "Sir, I'm Special Agent David Chen with the FBI. My badge and credentials are right here in the passenger seat. May I reach for them?" "Step out of the vehicle," the officer commanded, his voice sharp and aggressive. His name tag read Hutchins. "Officer Hutchins, I'm happy to cooperate, but can you tell me why I was pulled over?" David kept his voice even and professional. 15 years with the Bureau had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. "Your taillight is out. Now step out of the car." "I won't ask again." David glanced at his rearview mirror. He couldn't tell if the taillight was actually out or not, but it didn't matter now. He needed to de-escalate this situation. "Okay, I'm going to open my door slowly and step out. I just want you to know I'm a federal agent and I'm armed as part of my duties." The moment David mentioned being armed, Officer Hutchins's entire demeanor changed. His hand moved to his own weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Get out now." David's training kicked in. He slowly opened the door with his left hand while keeping his right hand visible on the steering wheel. He stepped out carefully, making sure every movement was slow and deliberate. "Turn around." "Hands on the vehicle!" Hutchins barked. David complied, placing his palms flat on the roof of the rental car. The metal was warm from sitting in the afternoon sun. He could hear Hutchins breathing heavily behind him, could sense the tension radiating from the man. "Officer, my FBI credentials are in the front seat. If you'll just look at them, we can clear this whole thing up," David said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline starting to pump through his system. "Shut up. I've seen fake badges before. You think you're smart? Driving through here in your fancy suit and expensive car?" There was something in Hutchins's voice now, something ugly that made David's blood run cold. This wasn't just about a broken taillight anymore. David had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize prejudice when he encountered it. He'd faced it before, though never quite like this. "I can give you the number to my field office. They can verify my identity in 2 minutes," David offered. "I said shut up." Hutchins grabbed David's arm roughly and yanked it behind his back. The movement was aggressive and unnecessary. David didn't resist, but his mind was racing now, calculating his options. In the distance, David could hear another siren approaching. Backup was coming. He wasn't sure if that was good or bad news. "On your knees," Hutchins ordered, pushing down on David's shoulder. "Officer, I don't think that's necessary," David said. But he was already lowering himself down, feeling the gravel dig into his knees through his dress pants. His $1,500 suit was getting ruined, but that was the least of his worries right now. Another police car pulled up and David felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe this officer would be more reasonable. Maybe they could sort this out. A female officer stepped out, younger than Hutchins, with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked at the scene in front of her, and David could see confusion cross her face. "What's the situation?" she called out, walking over. "Suspect claimed to be FBI, probably stolen credentials. He's armed," Hutchins said, his hand still gripping David's shoulder. "I am FBI," David said, looking at the new officer. "My name is Special Agent David Chen, badge number 7734. My credentials are in the front seat of that vehicle. Please just verify my identity." The female officer, her name tag read Rodriguez, looked uncertain. She glanced at Hutchins, then back at David. "Maybe we should check his credentials." "I've got this under control, Rodriguez," Hutchins snapped. "Call it in as a suspected impersonation of a federal officer." David's heart was pounding now. This was spiraling out of control fast. He'd been in dangerous situations before, had faced down armed criminals, but somehow this felt different. More unpredictable, more personal. "Officer Rodriguez," David said, keeping his voice as calm as he could manage. "Please, just look at my credentials. Call my supervisor. This is all a misunderstanding that can be cleared up in minutes." Rodriguez shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable. She looked at Hutchins again. It wouldn't hurt to just check. But Hutchins wasn't listening anymore. His prejudice had taken over completely, and David knew with growing certainty that this situation was about to get much worse before it got better. The sun continued to sink lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the quiet country road, and David Chen, a decorated federal agent with 15 years of service, knelt in the gravel, hoping that someone would listen to reason before this escalated beyond the point of no return. David stayed perfectly still on his knees, the gravel pressing into his skin through his pants. He could feel sweat starting to form on his forehead, even though the evening air was getting cooler. This wasn't how he'd imagined this day ending. Officer Rodriguez walked closer, her eyes moving between David and Hutchins. She seemed young, maybe only a few years on the force. David could see the uncertainty in her movements. She knew something wasn't right here, but she was also dealing with a fellow officer, someone she probably worked with every day. "Hutchins, I really think we should verify his story," Rodriguez said, her voice careful but firm. "It'll only take a few minutes." "I know what I'm doing, Rodriguez," Hutchins shot back. "I've been doing this job a lot longer than you. These guys, they come through here thinking they're better than us, thinking they can just flash some fake badge and we'll bow down." David's jaw tightened. There it was again, that tone. The way Hutchins said "these guys" made it crystal clear what he really meant. This had nothing to do with a broken taillight or fake credentials. This was about who David was, what he looked like. "Sir, I understand you're just doing your job," David said, trying one more time to reach through to whatever professionalism Hutchins might have left. "But I'm asking you, officer to officer, please just make one phone call. Call the FBI field office in Atlanta. They can confirm everything." "Officer to officer." Hutchins laughed, and it was a cold, bitter sound. "You're not an officer. You're a criminal trying to impersonate one. Big difference." Rodriguez pulled out her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 23. Can you run a verification check on FBI credentials for a—" She paused, looking at David. "Special Agent David Chen, badge number 7734, David said quickly, hope rising in his chest. But before Rodriguez could relay the information, Hutchins reached over and pressed the button on her radio, cutting off the transmission. "I said I've got this. What are you doing?" Rodriguez stepped back, her hand moving away from her radio. "We need to verify his identity. That's basic procedure. Are you questioning me right now?" Hutchins turned to face her fully, and David could see the anger in his body language. "Because if you can't handle following orders, maybe you should head back to the station." Rodriguez looked torn. David had seen this dynamic before. The struggle between doing the right thing and not wanting to go against a fellow officer. It was one of the hardest parts of law enforcement culture, that unspoken code that sometimes protected the wrong people. "I'm not questioning you," Rodriguez said slowly. "I'm trying to follow procedure, and procedure says we verify credentials when someone claims to be federal law enforcement." David felt a glimmer of respect for this young officer. She was scared, that was obvious, but she was still trying to do the right thing. That took courage. Hutchins moved closer to David, standing over him. "Where are you really from?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. I live in Virginia, David answered. I've been with the FBI for 15 years. Before that, I was with the Seattle Police Department for 3 years. I'm here on official business investigating a federal case. Virginia, Hutchins repeated mockingly. Funny, you don't sound like you're from Virginia. Where are you really from? David felt his stomach drop. He knew exactly what Hutchins was asking. I was born in California, he said evenly. But I don't see how that's relevant to this traffic stop. California. Hutchins nodded, as if that confirmed something in his mind. Figures. You people come down here, act like you own the place. Officer Hutchins, that's enough, Rodriguez said, her voice stronger now. This is getting out of hand. We need to call a supervisor. No one is calling anyone, Hutchins snapped. Now get back in your vehicle and let me handle this. But Rodriguez didn't move. David could see her hand hovering near her radio again. She was building up the courage to do something, to make that call even if it meant going against Hutchins. Sir, I need to call this in, Rodriguez said firmly. This situation needs a supervisor. Hutchins' face turned red. You want to make that call? Fine. But you better be ready to explain why you're not backing up a fellow officer, why you're taking the side of some suspect over your own. He's not a suspect if he's really FBI, Rodriguez pointed out, and the only way to know that is to verify his credentials. David wanted to thank this woman. She didn't even know him, had no reason to put her own career on the line, but she was doing it anyway because it was right. That gave him hope that maybe, just maybe, there were more good officers out there than bad ones. Hutchins turned back to David, his face twisted with anger. You got lucky today. Got yourself a sympathizer. He grabbed David's shoulder and hauled him roughly to his feet. Stand up. Keep your hands where I can see them. David stood slowly, his knees aching from kneeling on the gravel. He kept his hands raised at shoulder height, palms open and visible. Every instinct he had was screaming at him that this situation was dangerous, that Hutchins was unstable. I'm going to ask you one more time to verify my identity, David said, maintaining eye contact with Hutchins. If you don't, and this goes any further, you're going to have a lot of federal agents asking you a lot of uncomfortable questions. Is that a threat? Hutchins moved even closer, invading David's personal space. It's not a threat. It's a fact, David replied. You pull over a federal agent. You refuse to verify their credentials. You treat them like a criminal. There are going to be consequences. That's just how it works. For a moment, something flickered in Hutchins's eyes. Maybe it was doubt. Maybe it was the first hint of realization about what he was doing. But then it was gone, replaced by that same stubborn anger. The only consequences here are going to be for you, Hutchins said, for impersonating an officer, for resisting arrest, for whatever else I decide to charge you with. Rodriguez was on her radio now, speaking quietly but urgently. David couldn't hear what she was saying, but he hoped she was calling for that supervisor, calling for someone who could bring sanity back to this situation. You're making a huge mistake, David said, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact. He'd seen officers throw away their careers over pride and prejudice before. It never ended well. The only mistake here was you thinking you could drive through my town and disrespect me, Hutchins said. His hand moved to his belt, fingers brushing against his weapon. Now put your hands behind your head. Interlock your fingers. David's heart rate spiked. This was the moment he'd been dreading. The moment when a scared, angry, prejudiced officer with a gun decided to escalate instead of de-escalate. He'd investigated cases like this before, read reports, interviewed witnesses. He knew how quickly things could go wrong, but this time he wasn't the investigator. He was the victim, and that changed everything. He placed his hands behind his head slowly, each movement careful and deliberate. In the distance, he could hear another siren. Rodriguez's call for backup was bringing someone else to the scene. David just hoped they got there before Hutchins did something they'd all regret. Because right now, on this quiet country road, with the sun setting and tensions rising, David Chen wasn't sure he was going to make it home tonight. And that thought, more than anything else that had happened, terrified him to his core. The world seemed to slow down as David stood there, hands interlocked behind his head, watching Hutchins's right hand hover near his service weapon. In all his years of training, in all the dangerous situations he'd faced, David had never felt quite this helpless. Rodriguez was still on her radio, speaking urgently into it. David could make out fragments of what she was saying. Need a supervisor immediately. Situation escalating. Possible federal agent? Get off that radio, Rodriguez, Hutchins shouted, his voice cracking with anger. But she didn't stop talking. She'd made her choice, decided which side of this she was going to be on. David kept his breathing steady, or at least tried to. His crisis negotiation training was kicking in. The hundreds of hours he'd spent learning how to talk people down from bad decisions. The irony wasn't lost on him that now he was the one who needed to be the calm voice of reason. "Officer Hutchins," David said softly, carefully choosing each word. "I know you're just trying to do your job. I respect that. I've been in law enforcement for 18 years. I understand the stress, the uncertainty, but this doesn't have to go any further." Hutchins's hand wrapped around the grip of his weapon. David's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, kept his voice calm. "You don't know anything about my job," Hutchins spat out. "You come down here in your expensive suit, driving your fancy car, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, you're not better than me." "I never said I was," David replied, keeping his tone gentle but firm. "We're both law enforcement officers. We're on the same side here?" "We're not on the same side," Hutchins said, and now his weapon was coming out of its holster. The black metal caught the fading sunlight. "People like you're what's wrong with this country. Coming here, taking jobs, acting like you belong." David felt his blood run cold. This was beyond profiling now. This was pure hatred talking. And hatred combined with a badge and a gun was the most dangerous combination there was. "Hutchins, don't do this," Rodriguez called out. She'd finished on the radio and was now moving closer, her own hand near her weapon, though David couldn't tell if that made him feel safer or more at risk. "Put the gun away. Supervisor is on the way. We can sort this out properly." "There's nothing to sort out," Hutchins said, but his voice wavered slightly. David could see sweat on his forehead, could see his hand shaking just a bit as he raised the weapon. And then the gun was pointing directly at David's chest. Time seemed to freeze. David looked down the barrel of that service weapon and saw his whole life flash before him. His wife, his 2 kids, the family dinner he was supposed to be home for this weekend, his daughter's piano recital next month, his son's baseball game, all of it hanging in the balance because of one man's hatred. "Officer, please," David said, and he hated how his voice cracked on that last word. "Don't do this. Don't throw your life away. Don't make a decision you can't take back. Shut up." Hutchins screamed, and his finger moved toward the trigger. "Get on your knees. Now on your knees." David's training told him to comply, but his instinct told him that getting on his knees might be the last thing he ever did. He'd read enough reports, seen enough footage. People shot while they were kneeling, while they were complying, while they were doing everything right. "Hutchins, lower your weapon." Rodriguez had her own gun out now, but she wasn't pointing it at anyone. She held it down at her side, her face a mask of stress and fear. "This is not how we do things." "Lower your weapon." "Stay out of this, Rodriguez." Hutchins yelled back, but he didn't lower the gun. If anything, he seemed to grip it tighter. David could see Hutchins's finger resting on the trigger now. Not pressing, not yet, but right there. One moment of anger, one split-second decision, and it would all be over. David had investigated enough officer-involved shootings to know how quickly it could happen, how one heartbeat could be the difference between life and death. "I have a family," David said quietly, looking directly into Hutchins's eyes. "I have a wife, 2 kids. They're waiting for me to come home tonight. Please don't take that away from them. Please don't make my kids grow up without a father." For just a second, something changed in Hutchins's expression. Maybe it was humanity breaking through the hatred. Maybe it was doubt. But then it was gone and the anger was back. "Should have thought about that before you came here trying to fool me," Hutchins said. "Should have thought about that before you disrespected me." "I never disrespected you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I identified myself as a federal agent. I offered to prove it. That's not disrespect. That's procedure." The siren David had heard earlier was getting louder now. Someone else was coming. Someone who might have the authority to stop this madness before it went too far. But would they get here in time? Rodriguez was talking into her radio again, her voice high and stressed. "Supervisor, we need you here now. Officer has weapon drawn on suspect who claims to be FBI. Situation is critical." "He's not a suspect." David wanted to scream, but he kept his voice level. "My credentials are right there in the car. 20 feet away. Just look at them, please." Hutchins's jaw clenched. David could see the internal struggle happening, could see the man warring with his own prejudices and pride. This was the moment, David knew. The moment where Hutchins would either see reason or do something that would destroy multiple lives forever. "You think you're so smart," Hutchins said, and David could hear the tremor in his voice now. The man was scared too, David realized. Scared that maybe he'd made a mistake. Scared of what would happen if David really was who he said he was, but too proud and too hateful to back down. "You think you can just talk your way out of this?" "I'm not trying to talk my way out of anything," David said carefully. "I'm trying to help you avoid making the worst mistake of your life. Because if you pull that trigger, if you shoot an unarmed federal agent, your life is over. Your career is over. Everything you've worked for is gone. And for what? Because you didn't want to check a badge." The approaching siren was very close now. David could see flashing lights reflecting off the cars around them. Whoever was coming was almost here. "Last chance," Hutchins said, and his voice was shaking now. "On your knees. Hands behind your back. Do it now or I'll drop you right here." David looked into the man's eyes and saw something that terrified him more than the gun itself. He saw that Hutchins might actually do it. Might actually pull that trigger. Not because David was a threat. Not because it was necessary. But because his pride wouldn't let him admit he was wrong. Rodriguez had stepped closer, positioning herself at an angle where she could see both David and Hutchins. Her gun was still out, still pointed at the ground, but David could see her finger near the trigger guard. She was ready to act if she had to, but she was hoping she wouldn't have to choose between a fellow officer and doing what was right. The third vehicle screeched to a stop behind the other two police cars. A door opened. Footsteps on gravel, and then a voice strong and commanding cut through all the tension like a knife. "Officer Hutchins, lower your weapon immediately." David didn't dare turn his head to see who it was, but the voice was female, older, and carried the kind of authority that came from decades of experience, someone who was used to being obeyed. But Hutchins's gun was still pointed at David's chest, still one trigger pull away from ending everything. And in that frozen moment, with the gun, the sunset, the witnesses, and the weight of consequences all hanging in the balance, David Chen did the only thing he could do. He waited, and he hoped that whoever had just arrived had enough power to stop this, before it became a tragedy that would make the national news and break his family's hearts forever. Police Chief Dorothy Brennan had been in law enforcement for 30 years. She'd seen just about everything a person could see in this job. But as she walked toward the scene unfolding on that country road, her stomach turned in a way it hadn't in a long time. An officer with his weapon drawn on an unarmed, compliant individual. Another officer looking panicked and torn. And a man in a business suit with his hands behind his head trying not to get killed. "Hutchins," Chief Brennan's voice boomed across the scene. "I said lower your weapon. That's a direct order." Hutchins didn't move at first. His gun was still pointed at David, his fingers still near that trigger. For a terrible moment, Chief Brennan thought he might not comply, that she might have to witness one of her own officers commit an act that would destroy everyone involved. "Officer Hutchins," she said again, walking closer but keeping her tone commanding. "You will lower that weapon right now, or you will be placed under arrest. Your choice. Make it quick." Something in her voice must have broken through because Hutchins's hand started to shake. The gun wavered, and then slowly he lowered it, though he didn't holster it. "That man is impersonating a federal officer," Hutchins said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He had fake credentials. He was resisting. I was following procedure." Chief Brennan looked at the scene more carefully. The man in the suit, still standing with his hands behind his head, hadn't moved an inch. He looked calm. Too calm for someone who just had a gun pointed at him. That was the first thing that struck her as odd. Most people would be shaking, crying, or angry. This man just looked patient, like he was waiting for common sense to prevail. "Rodriguez, what's the situation here?" Chief Brennan asked, turning to the younger officer. Rodriguez holstered her weapon before speaking. "Chief, we pulled over this vehicle for a broken taillight." The driver immediately identified himself as FBI Special Agent David Chen. He offered his credentials, offered to have us verify his identity. Hutchins refused to look at the credentials and escalated the situation. "I called for a supervisor because," she hesitated, glancing at Hutchins, "because I believed the situation was getting out of control." "He's lying," Hutchins protested. "He never said he was FBI until after I asked him to step out of the vehicle. He was being aggressive and non-compliant." Officer Hutchins, I'm going to ask you to be quiet now, Chief Brennan said firmly. She walked over to David, studying him carefully. Sir, you can lower your hands, slowly. David brought his hands down, and Chief Brennan could see the relief wash over his face, though he still looked cautious. Smart man. You said your name is David Chen? Special agent with the FBI? She asked. Yes, ma'am, David replied, his voice steady despite what he'd just been through. My credentials are in the front seat of the rental car. Badge number 7734. I'm based out of the Virginia field office, but I'm here investigating a federal fraud case. Chief Brennan walked to the car and looked inside. There on the passenger seat was an FBI credentials case. She carefully opened it and examined the badge and ID inside. They looked legitimate, but she'd verify that properly. She pulled out her phone and dialed the FBI field office in Atlanta. It was after hours, but there was always someone on duty. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. FBI Atlanta field office, Agent Peterson speaking. This is Police Chief Dorothy Brennan from Millbrook County Sheriff's Department. I need immediate verification of credentials for someone claiming to be Special Agent David Chen, badge number 7734. There was a pause, the sound of typing on a keyboard. Then Agent Chen is one of ours, yes. What's this regarding? One of my officers pulled him over and there's been a situation. I need to know if he's really who he says he is. He's definitely FBI, Agent Peterson confirmed. Has been for 15 years. What kind of situation are we talking about? Chief Brennan glanced back at Hutchins, who was now looking pale. The kind that's going to require a very detailed report. Thank you for confirming. She hung up and walked back to the group. Her face was set in a hard expression that everyone who worked under her had learned to fear. It was the look she got when someone had really messed up. Agent Chen, I apologize, she said first, looking directly at David. Your credentials are verified. You're free to go, though I'd appreciate if you'd stay for a few minutes so we can sort out what happened here. Of course, David said, and Chief Brennan could hear the relief in his voice. Then she turned to Hutchins. Holster your weapon, now! Hutchins did, but his face was red, and he was already trying to form his defense. Chief, I was just being careful. These days you can't be too careful. He could have been dangerous. He identified himself as a federal agent and offered proof. You refused to verify his credentials, Chief Brennan said, her voice cold. That's not being careful. That's being negligent at best. I thought the credentials looked fake, Hutchins insisted. Then you call it in. You verify. You don't draw your weapon on an unarmed, compliant individual who's done nothing threatening. Chief Brennan shot back. Rodriguez, is your body camera on? Yes, Chief, has been since I arrived on scene. Good. Send me that footage immediately, Chief Brennan said. Then she looked at Hutchins again. Your body camera was on too, I assume. Hutchins didn't answer right away, and that silence told Chief Brennan everything she needed to know. Officer Hutchins, was your body camera activated during this traffic stop? She asked again. I forgot to turn it on, Hutchins mumbled. Chief Brennan felt her anger rising, but she kept it controlled. 30 years on the job had taught her that losing your temper never solved anything. You forgot to turn on your camera during what you claim was a dangerous encounter with a potentially armed suspect. That's convenient. She looked at her dashboard camera. She'd turned it on the moment she'd gotten Rodriguez's urgent call, and it had been recording since she'd arrived on scene. It wouldn't have caught everything, but it would have caught enough. The gun pointing at an unarmed man. The threats. The refusal to verify credentials. Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, did Agent Chen do anything threatening or non-compliant during this stop? Chief Brennan asked. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable, but to her credit, she answered honestly. No, Chief, he was completely compliant. He kept his hands visible at all times, moved slowly, spoke respectfully. He repeatedly asked us to verify his credentials and offered multiple ways to do so. Chief Brennan nodded. She looked at Hutchins, and for the first time in years, she felt deeply ashamed of someone wearing her department's uniform. Hutchins, I've been doing this job for 3 decades, she said quietly. I've made mistakes, seen others make mistakes. We're all human. But what I just witnessed wasn't a mistake. It was a complete failure of judgment, procedure, and basic human decency. Chief, I can explain. Hutchins started, but she held up her hand. No explanations right now. Here's what's going to happen, Chief Brennan said, her voice taking on that commanding tone again. You are going to remove your badge and your service weapon. You are going to hand them to me. And you are going to be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Hutchins's mouth dropped open. You can't do this. I was just doing my job. Your job is to serve and protect, not to terrorize innocent people, Chief Brennan said. Your job is to verify information when it's offered, not to let your personal biases cloud your judgment. Your job is to de-escalate situations, not point weapons at unarmed federal agents. She held out her hand. Badge and weapon now. Hutchins looked around as if hoping someone would support him. But Rodriguez was looking away, and even the few other officers who'd gathered during the commotion were silent. They all knew he'd crossed a line. Slowly, his face burning with humiliation and anger, Hutchins unpinned his badge and placed it in Chief Brennan's hand. Then he removed his service weapon, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and handed it over as well. Chief Brennan took both items and looked at him with disappointment that was somehow worse than anger. You're to report to Internal Affairs first thing Monday morning. Until then, you're not to wear any department insignia, carry any department equipment, or identify yourself as a police officer. Is that understood? This is because of him, Hutchins said, pointing at David. This is because you're choosing him over your own officer. This is because you nearly shot an innocent man, Chief Brennan said sharply. This is because you let hatred and prejudice override your training and your oath. Don't try to make yourself the victim here, Hutchins. You're not. She turned to David. Agent Chen, I'd like to speak with you privately if you have a moment. David nodded, and they walked a few feet away from the others. Chief Brennan looked at this man who'd handled himself with remarkable calm during what must have been one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. I'm sorry one of my officers put you through that. I'm sorry our department failed you today, and I promise you, this will be investigated thoroughly. David looked at her for a long moment. Chief, I appreciate that, but I need you to know something. This isn't the first time Hutchins has done this, is it? The question hit Chief Brennan like a punch to the gut because he was right, and her silence confirmed it. Chief Brennan looked down at the badge and gun in her hands. They felt heavier than they should have, not because of their physical weight, but because of what they represented, the power she'd just stripped away from someone. The trust that had been broken, the failure that went deeper than just one officer's actions. You're right, she said quietly to David. This isn't the first complaint against Hutchins. There have been 3 others in the past 2 years. David's expression didn't change, but she could see the disappointment in his eyes. He'd been hoping he was wrong. What happened with those complaints? He asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. They were investigated. He received counseling, additional training, written warnings, Chief Brennan said. And even as she spoke the words, she realized how hollow they sounded. We thought we could correct the behavior. But you couldn't, David said. It wasn't a question. No, we couldn't. Chief Brennan felt the full weight of that failure settling on her shoulders. And tonight it almost cost you your life. I can't apologize enough for that. Behind them, Hutchins was arguing with Rodriguez, his voice loud and defensive. Chief Brennan could hear snippets of it, claims that he was being treated unfairly, that he was just doing his job, that everyone was overreacting. She turned back to look at him, this man who'd worn her department's uniform, who'd taken the same oath she had, who'd somehow lost his way so completely that he could point a gun at an innocent person and feel justified doing it. Hutchins, she called out. I told you to be quiet. One more outburst and I'll have Rodriguez transport you to the station in handcuffs. Your choice. That finally shut him up, though the anger on his face was clear. Chief Brennan turned back to David. I know this is a lot to ask after what you've just been through, but I need your statement. Everything that happened from the moment Hutchins pulled you over until I arrived. And I need to know if you want to file a formal complaint with the FBI. I'll give you my statement, David said. As for the complaint, that's not really optional. This has to be reported to my superiors, an FBI agent having a weapon drawn on him by local law enforcement. That's going to trigger an automatic investigation. Chief Brennan nodded. She'd expected that. I understand, and frankly I welcome it. This department needs to take a hard look at itself. We need outside eyes on this. David studied her for a moment. Can I ask you something, Chief? Of course. Why didn't you do something sooner? After the first complaint or the second? Why did it take getting to this point before you took action? It was the question Chief Brennan had been asking herself since the moment she'd seen Hutchins with that gun drawn. The question that was going to keep her up at night for a long time to come. Because I believed in second chances, she said honestly. Because I thought people could change. Because I didn't want to end someone's career over what I thought were mistakes that could be corrected. And because... She paused, forcing herself to be completely honest. Because it's hard to fire one of your own. It's hard to admit that someone you hired, someone you trained, someone who works beside you every day is capable of this kind of hatred. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away, David said gently. It just means eventually someone gets hurt. Tonight I got lucky. Your officer Rodriguez was brave enough to call for help. You arrived in time. But what about next time? What about the person who isn't a federal agent, who doesn't have the training to handle a situation like this? Every word hit home because David was absolutely right. Chief Brennan had been so focused on giving Hutchins chances to improve that she'd lost sight of the bigger picture. She'd prioritized one officer's career over the safety of the community she'd sworn to protect. There won't be a next time, Chief Brennan said firmly. Not with Hutchins. And I'm going to make sure this department does better. I'm going to review every complaint we've had in the past 5 years. Every excessive force report. Every accusation of bias or discrimination. And anyone who shows a pattern is going to face real consequences. She looked back at Hutchins, who was now sitting on the ground by Rodriguez's patrol car, his face in his hands. She felt no satisfaction in seeing him like that. Just sadness for what could have been and anger at what was. You know what the worst part is? Chief Brennan said, more to herself than to David. I looked at his record before I hired him. He came from another department with glowing recommendations. 5 years of service, no major incidents. I thought he was perfect for our team. What department? David asked, suddenly alert. County Sheriff's Office, about 2 hours north of here. Why? Because I'm willing to bet if you dig deeper, you'll find he had problems there too, David said. Problems that got swept under the rug or handled quietly. And when those problems started becoming too obvious to ignore, they let him transfer rather than dealing with it properly. That's how these officers end up moving from department to department. Nobody wants to be the one to end their career, so they just pass the problem along. Chief Brennan felt her jaw tighten. I'll be making some calls on Monday morning. They spent the next hour going through everything. David gave his detailed statement, walking Chief Brennan through every moment of the stop. How Hutchins had immediately been aggressive. How he'd refused to look at credentials. How he'd made it clear this wasn't about a broken taillight or proper procedure. How he'd drawn his weapon and pointed it at David's chest while David stood there. Unarmed and compliant. Rodriguez gave her statement too, confirming everything David said and adding her own observations. She described the fear she'd felt watching the situation escalate. How she'd known something was wrong but had struggled with going against another officer. How she'd finally decided that protecting a potentially innocent person was more important than the unwritten code of police loyalty. You did the right thing, Chief Brennan told Rodriguez firmly. What you did today took real courage. A lot of officers wouldn't have made that call. They would have stood by and watched and told themselves they were just supporting their partner. But you saw something wrong and you acted. That's what good police work looks like. Rodriguez looked relieved and exhausted. I was scared I'd be wrong. That maybe Hutchins did see something I didn't. Your instincts were correct, Chief Brennan said. Trust them. They'll serve you well in this career. As the sun finally set completely, casting the scene in darkness broken only by the flashing police lights, Chief Brennan made arrangements for David to continue on his way. His rental car was fine, the taillight was actually working properly. There had never been anything wrong with it. That had just been Hutchins's excuse to pull him over. Agent Chen, Chief Brennan said as David was preparing to leave. I know words don't mean much right now, but I want you to know that what happened here tonight doesn't represent what this department stands for. Most of my officers are good people who do this job for the right reasons. I know that, David said. I've been in law enforcement long enough to know that most cops are decent people trying to do a hard job. But the ones who aren't, they're the ones who make the headlines. They're the ones who destroy trust between the police and the communities they serve. They're the ones who make it harder for good officers like Rodriguez to do their jobs. He looked over at where Hutchins still sat, isolated and silent. I hope you follow through on what you said. About reviewing complaints and holding people accountable, because if you don't, this will happen again. Maybe not here, maybe not with Hutchins, but somewhere with someone. And next time, It might not end with just a badge and gun being taken away. Next time, someone might die. Chief Brennan watched David drive away, his taillights disappearing into the darkness. Then she turned back to the scene. Hutchins would need to be driven home since he'd come in a patrol car. Rodriguez would need to finish her report. And Chief Brennan would need to start the long, difficult process of figuring out how her department had failed so badly that an innocent man had nearly been killed on a quiet country road. She looked down at the badge and gun still in her hands. Hutchins had worn this badge with pride once, had taken an oath to serve and protect. Somewhere along the way, he'd lost sight of what that oath meant. Or maybe he'd never really understood it in the first place. Chief Brennan had been a cop for 30 years. She'd seen the best of people and the worst of people. She'd seen heroes and she'd seen cowards. She'd seen justice and she'd seen failure. Tonight she'd seen all of it at once, and tomorrow she'd begin the work of making sure her department never failed like this again. Because David Chen was right. Next time they might not be so lucky. Next time someone might not make it home to their family. And Chief Brennan was determined that on her watch there wouldn't be a next time. 3 hours later, Chief Brennan sat in her office at the police station. It was past 10 at night, but she couldn't bring herself to go home yet. Not after what had happened. Not when there was so much work to be done. David Chen sat across from her desk, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd driven to the station to complete the formal paperwork, even though she could tell he was exhausted. The adrenaline from the encounter had worn off, and now he just looked tired and older than he probably was. "How are you holding up?" Chief Brennan asked, knowing it was an inadequate question but not knowing what else to say. David gave her a small, sad smile. "I've been better. I've been worse too, honestly. In this job, you see a lot of things that shake you up, but usually I'm the one investigating those things, not living through them." "Have you called your family?" she asked. "Not yet. I will, but—" He trailed off, staring into his coffee. "What do I tell them?" "Hi, honey. I almost didn't make it home tonight because a police officer pointed a gun at me for driving while Asian. How do I explain that to my kids?" Chief Brennan had no answer for that. She had 2 grown children of her own, both in college now. She'd always told them that police officers were there to help, to protect. What would she tell them if she'd been in David's shoes? "For what it's worth, I am truly sorry," she said. "And I know you've heard that from me already, but I need you to understand that I mean it. What Hutchins did tonight was inexcusable. It was criminal, and it's going to be treated as such." David looked up at her. "You said there were 3 previous complaints against him. Can you tell me about them?" Chief Brennan pulled out a file she'd been reviewing. She'd requested Hutchins's complete personnel file the moment she'd gotten back to the station. Reading through it had made her sick to her stomach. "The first one was 18 months ago," she began. "A traffic stop similar to yours. Black man, out-of-state plates, professional job. Hutchins pulled him over for supposedly speeding. The man filed a complaint saying Hutchins used excessive force during the stop, was aggressive and hostile, and made racially charged comments. We investigated, but Hutchins denied everything. Without body camera footage, it became he said, she said. We gave Hutchins a written warning and sent him to diversity training." "Body camera footage," David repeated. "He didn't have it on then either, did he?" "No. He claimed the camera malfunctioned," Chief Brennan said, feeling the shame of it. "We should have seen that as a red flag. We should have known he was deliberately avoiding recording these encounters." "What about the second complaint?" David asked, 6 months later. This time, a Latino family at a routine welfare check. Neighbor had called because they heard shouting. But it turned out to be the family just having a loud dinner party. Hutchins entered the home without a warrant, was aggressive with the father, and allegedly made comments about their immigration status. The family filed a complaint. Again, no body camera footage. Again, Hutchins had an excuse. Again, we gave him counseling and additional training. "And the third?" Chief Brennan sighed. 3 months ago, young black woman, college student, pulled over for a broken taillight. Similar pattern to what happened with you tonight. Hutchins was aggressive, wouldn't accept her ID, accused her of giving false information. Her complaint said he made her feel threatened and unsafe. She didn't mention a weapon being drawn, but she did say Hutchins kept his hand on his gun the entire time. We investigated, gave Hutchins a final written warning, and told him one more incident would result in suspension. But it didn't, David said quietly. It resulted in him nearly shooting a federal agent. "I failed," Chief Brennan admitted, and saying it out loud felt like a weight lifting off her chest and crushing down on it at the same time. I saw the pattern. I knew there was a problem, but I kept thinking he could change. I kept thinking more training, more counseling, more chances would fix whatever was broken in him. Some things can't be fixed, David said. Some people shouldn't be police officers. It's that simple. You're right. And I should have recognized that sooner. Chief Brennan closed the file. Can I ask you something? In your experience with the FBI, investigating civil rights cases and officer-involved incidents, how common is this? Officers with multiple complaints who keep getting chance after chance? David leaned back in his chair. Too common. Way too common. There's this thing we see over and over in these cases. An officer has a pattern of behavior. Complaints keep coming in. But each one is handled individually instead of looking at the bigger picture. And then one day that officer does something that can't be swept under the rug. Someone dies or nearly dies, and everyone asks how this could have happened when all the warning signs were there. The warning signs were there, Chief Brennan said. I just didn't want to see them. Or maybe I saw them but convinced myself they weren't as bad as they were. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet town she'd sworn to protect. Millbrook County wasn't a big place. About 15,000 people, mostly spread out across rural areas. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where crime was relatively low, where police officers were supposed to be part of the community, not feared by it. I came up in a different era, she said, not turning around. When I joined the force 30 years ago, things were different. Not better, not by a long shot, probably worse in a lot of ways. But we thought we were making progress, thought we were getting better at this. And then something like tonight happens and I realize how much further we still have to go. Progress isn't a straight line, David said from behind her. It's messy. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes 3 steps back. But the important thing is that when you see the steps backward, you correct course. You don't just keep going in the wrong direction because turning around is hard. Chief Brennan turned back to face him. What happens now? From the FBI's perspective, my supervisor will be notified tonight. There'll be an investigation, probably led by our Civil Rights Division. They'll want to interview everyone involved, review all the footage, look at Hutchins' history. Depending on what they find, there could be federal charges. Good, Chief Brennan said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. He should face charges. What he did tonight was assault with a deadly weapon at minimum. The fact that he was wearing a badge when he did it makes it worse, not better. David looked at her with something like respect. Not every chief would say that about one of their own officers. He's not one of my officers anymore, Chief Brennan said firmly. The moment he pointed that gun at you, he stopped being a police officer. He became a criminal who happened to be wearing a uniform. They talked for another hour, going through details, discussing next steps. David would file his official report with the FBI. Chief Brennan would conduct her own internal investigation, though she knew it would likely be overtaken by the federal one. She'd also begin the process of terminating Hutchins's employment, though that would take time given union contracts and employment laws. As David was preparing to leave, he paused at the door. Chief, can I give you some advice? Please, don't just focus on Hutchins. Look at the system that allowed him to get away with this behavior for so long. Look at how complaints are handled, how investigations are conducted, how officers are trained and supervised. Because getting rid of one bad officer is good. But if the system that enabled him stays in place, there'll just be another one behind him. You're right, Chief Brennan said, and I promise you, that's exactly what I'm going to do. Starting tomorrow, this department is going to change, not because we have to, but because it's right. After David left, Chief Brennan sat alone in her office for a long time. She thought about the oath she'd taken 30 years ago. To serve and protect, to uphold the law, to be a guardian of her community. She'd failed that oath tonight, not by her own actions, but by her inaction, by not seeing what was right in front of her, by giving chances to someone who'd proven over and over that he didn't deserve them. She picked up her phone and called her husband. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Dorothy, everything okay? No, she said honestly. Everything's not okay. But it's going to be. I'm going to make sure of it. She told him what had happened, leaving out some of the details but giving him enough to understand the gravity of the situation. He listened quietly, the way he'd listened to her talk about work for 30 years. What are you going to do? He asked when she finished. "I'm going to fix this," she said. "However long it takes, whatever it costs, I'm going to make sure this department is better. I owe that to David Chen. I owe that to every person who's ever filed a complaint that we didn't take seriously enough. I owe that to every good officer on my force who does their job the right way." "I know you will," he said. "You've never backed down from doing the right thing, even when it's hard. That's why you're good at this job." But as Chief Brennan hung up the phone and finally headed home, she wondered if being good at the job was enough. Because someone had nearly died tonight on her watch in her county. Because of an officer she'd hired and failed to remove when she should have. Being good at the job meant preventing situations like this, not just responding to them after the fact. The next 3 weeks moved fast and slow at the same time. Fast because there was so much happening, so many interviews and reports and meetings. Slow because for David Chen, every day felt like reliving that moment when Hutchins had pointed a gun at his chest. He'd made it to his witness interview the next day, though he'd barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that gun barrel, heard Hutchins' voice full of hatred, felt the gravel digging into his knees. His supervisor at the FBI, Special Agent in Charge Patricia Morrison, had called him personally after reading his report. She'd been furious not at David, but at what had happened to him. "You're taking time off," she'd said, and it wasn't a suggestion. "I'm fine," David had protested. "I have cases to work. Your cases can wait. You had a weapon pointed at you by someone who should have been protecting you. That's traumatic, David. Take the time. Talk to someone. Process this." So David had taken a week off, the first unplanned time off he'd taken in years. He'd gone home to his family and tried to explain what had happened. His wife had cried. His kids had been confused and scared. How do you tell a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old that their dad almost didn't come home because of the color of his skin and the prejudice in someone's heart? But the investigation moved forward without him for those first few days. The FBI's Civil Rights Division took over, as David had expected. 2 agents, Robert Hayes and Jennifer Park, arrived in Millbrook County with a mandate to figure out exactly what had happened and whether federal charges were warranted. They started with the video footage. Rodriguez's body camera had captured most of the encounter, from the moment she'd arrived until Chief Brennan had taken Hutchins's badge and gun. The footage was damning. It showed David being completely compliant, repeatedly offering to verify his identity, and Hutchins escalating the situation at every turn. The audio was even worse. Hutchins's words, full of racial implications and stereotypes, were all recorded. His refusal to follow basic procedure, his threats. His finger on that trigger. Chief Brennan's dashboard camera had captured the final moments, including Hutchins pointing his weapon at David and refusing to lower it until ordered by his chief. That footage had already been turned over to the county district attorney. Agent Hayes interviewed Rodriguez first. She'd been nervous, worried that being honest might hurt her career or make her an outcast in the department. But she told the truth, every detail of it. "I knew something was wrong from the beginning," she told Hayes. "The way Hutchins was acting, the way he refused to even look at the credentials. I've been a cop for 4 years, and I've never seen someone so determined to escalate a situation that should have been simple." "Why didn't you intervene sooner?" Hayes asked, not accusatory, just trying to understand. Rodriguez had thought about that question a lot over the past few days. "Because I was scared. Not of Agent Chen, but of going against another officer. There's this culture in policing where you back up your partner no matter what. And I knew if I challenged Hutchins, if I sided with a civilian over him, I'd be labeled as disloyal. But then I saw him put his hand on his weapon, and I realized that being labeled disloyal was better than watching someone die." "You did the right thing," Hayes assured her. "Your call for a supervisor probably saved Agent Chen's life." They interviewed Chief Brennan next, who brought every file, every report, every piece of documentation related to Hutchins. She'd spent the past week going through not just Hutchins's records, but the records of every officer in her department. "I found 12 officers with complaint histories," she told the FBI agents. Not all of them as serious as Hutchins, but patterns nonetheless. Officers who'd had multiple complaints that were addressed with minimal consequences. "I've already started the process of reviewing each case individually." "What about Hutchins specifically?" Agent Park asked. "Looking back now, what warning signs do you see that you missed before?" Chief Brennan had prepared for this question. She'd been asking it of herself every night. "All of them. The repeated equipment malfunctions with his body camera, the fact that every complaint against him involved people of color, the way his reports would characterize encounters as threatening or non-compliant, when the actual evidence suggested otherwise. I saw all of it and I told myself we could fix it with training and counseling. I was wrong. The FBI agents also interviewed the 3 people who'd filed previous complaints against Hutchins. Each one told a similar story. Aggressive behavior, racial undertones, a complete unwillingness to see them as anything other than threats or criminals. One of them, a man named Travis Williams who'd been pulled over 18 months before, broke down during his interview. I thought I was crazy, he said. Thought maybe I was being too sensitive or reading too much into it. But when I heard what happened to that FBI agent, I realized it wasn't in my head. That officer really was dangerous. And if he'd had a worse day, if I'd moved the wrong way, it could have been me with a gun pointed at me. But the most important interview was with Hutchins himself. The FBI agents approached him at his home, since he was on administrative leave. He'd lawyered up immediately, which was his right, but he agreed to answer some basic questions with his attorney present. He sat in his living room, looking smaller somehow without his uniform and badge. Agent Hayes laid out the evidence in front of him. The video footage, the audio recordings, the statements from Rodriguez and Chief Brennan and David Chen. Do you understand the severity of what you're facing here? Hayes asked. We're looking at potential federal charges. Deprivation of rights under color of law, assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment. These are serious crimes with serious penalties. Hutchins's attorney, a local man named George Crawford, cleared his throat. My client maintains that he was following proper procedure during what he perceived as a potentially dangerous encounter. Proper procedure, Agent Park repeated, looking at Hutchins. Is it proper procedure to refuse to verify credentials when offered? To draw a weapon on an unarmed, compliant individual? To make racially charged comments throughout an encounter? For the first time, Hutchins spoke directly. I was protecting myself. You don't know what it's like out there. Every traffic stop could be your last. I've seen officers killed doing routine stops. So have I, Hayes said. I've been a cop for 20 years before joining the FBI. I know exactly what it's like out there. And you know what? I've never had to point my gun at someone who was being compliant and offering to prove their identity. I've never had to refuse basic verification procedures because I was too convinced of my own assumptions. And I've never let my personal prejudices override my training. Hutchins's face reddened. I don't have any prejudices. This isn't about race. Agent Park pulled out the audio transcript, highlighted sections marking every racially charged comment Hutchins had made during the encounter. Then explain these comments. Explain why every single complaint against you has involved people of color. Explain why you saw a professional man in a suit and immediately treated him like a criminal. Hutchins had no good answer for that. His attorney tried to steer the conversation away, but the damage was done. The FBI agents had what they needed. Over the following weeks, they built their case. They interviewed Hutchins's previous department, the one he transferred from before joining Millbrook County. Just as David had suspected, there had been problems there too. 2 complaints that had been quietly resolved, with the department essentially encouraging Hutchins to seek employment elsewhere, rather than face formal discipline. They also discovered that Hutchins had been active in several online forums known for extremist views. Posts where he complained about immigration, about diversity initiatives in law enforcement, about what he perceived as special treatment for minorities. Nothing explicitly illegal, but it painted a picture of someone whose views were fundamentally incompatible with serving as a police officer. The county district attorney, a woman named Helen Martinez, reviewed the evidence and made her decision. She'd been a prosecutor for 15 years and had seen a lot of cases, but this one made her angry in a way few cases did. We're charging him, she told Chief Brennan and the FBI agents at a meeting 3 weeks after the incident. Assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, deprivation of civil rights, and official misconduct. If convicted on all counts, he's looking at significant prison time. What are the chances of conviction? Chief Brennan asked. With this evidence, very good. The video footage alone is enough to convict. But combined with his history and the witness statements, this is one of the strongest cases I've seen. Martinez paused. I want you to understand something, Chief. I'm not just prosecuting this case because of what happened to Agent Chen, though that would be enough. I'm prosecuting it because of all the people Hutchins victimized before. all the complaints that didn't result in serious consequences. This case is about accountability, and it's about sending a message that officers who abuse their power will face justice. David returned to work after his week off, but he wasn't the same. His colleagues noticed it. His wife noticed it. He was more cautious now, more aware of his surroundings in a way he hadn't been before. When he saw police officers in public, 3 months after that night on the country road, Dale Hutchins sat in a courtroom wearing civilian clothes and handcuffs. The man who'd once worn a badge with authority now looked small and defeated. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching their verdict, guilty on all counts. David sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as the judge read through each charge. Assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment. Deprivation of civil rights under color of law, official misconduct. For each one, the jury foreman stood and repeated that single word, guilty. Hutchins's face remained blank, but his attorney looked devastated. They'd tried to argue that Hutchins had been following his training, that he'd felt threatened, that his actions were within the bounds of reasonable officer conduct. The jury hadn't bought it. The evidence had been too strong, the pattern too clear. Judge Margaret Richardson looked at Hutchins with an expression that mixed disappointment and anger. She was a veteran judge who'd presided over thousands of cases in her career, but she took particular offense to this one. "Mr. Hutchins," she said, and the deliberate use of Mr. instead of officer wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. "You were given a badge and a gun and the authority to serve your community. That's a sacred trust. People are supposed to be able to look at a police officer and feel safe, not terrified. You violated that trust in the worst possible way." She continued, detailing the evidence against him. The video footage showing his aggression, the audio recordings capturing his prejudiced comments, the testimony from multiple victims, the pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for too long. "You nearly killed an innocent man," Judge Richardson said. "An innocent man who was a fellow law enforcement officer, who was complying with every instruction, who posed no threat whatsoever. And you did it not because he was dangerous, but because of who he was, because of your own prejudices and hatred." The sentencing took another hour. When it was done, Hutchins was facing 12 years in state prison with federal charges still pending. He'd also lost his law enforcement certification permanently, meaning he could never work as a police officer again in any state. As they led Hutchins out of the courtroom in handcuffs, David felt something he hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not joy, but a deep sadness. This man's hatred had nearly cost David his life and had now cost Hutchins his freedom. Everyone lost in situations like this. Everyone. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting. The case had gotten significant media attention, not just locally but nationally. It had become a symbol of both the problems in American policing and the possibility of accountability when systems worked correctly. District Attorney Martinez held a press conference on the courthouse steps. David stood beside her, along with Chief Brennan and Officer Rodriguez. "Today, justice was served," Martinez said into the microphones. "But this case represents more than just one conviction. It represents a commitment to holding law enforcement accountable when they violate the trust placed in them. No one is above the law, not even those who wear a badge." She turned to David. "Agent Chen showed remarkable courage, both during the incident and throughout this process. He could have walked away, could have decided it wasn't worth the time and emotional energy to see this through. But he didn't. He stood up not just for himself but for every person who's been victimized by officers who abuse their power." David stepped up to the microphone, his hands shaking slightly. He'd prepared remarks, but now that he was standing here, they felt inadequate. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "This case isn't about all police officers. The vast majority of law enforcement officers are good people, doing an incredibly difficult job." Officer Rodriguez proved that when she had the courage to call for help, even though it meant going against a fellow officer. Chief Brennan proved it when she took immediate action and stripped Hutchins of his authority. He paused, collecting his thoughts. "But we can't ignore the problem either. There are officers out there, not many but enough, who see certain people as less than human because of their race or ethnicity. And when those officers are allowed to remain on the force despite warning signs, despite complaints, despite patterns of behavior, people get hurt, people die." A reporter shouted a question. "Do you think this verdict will change anything?" David considered that. I hope so. I hope departments across the country look at this case and realize that ignoring complaints and giving endless second chances doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the communities being policed, and it doesn't help good officers who are trying to do their jobs right. Real accountability when someone shows they can't or won't do the job properly, that's what protects everyone. Chief Brennan spoke next, and her voice was firm but emotional. 3 months ago, my department failed. We failed Agent Chen, we failed our community, and we failed every person who'd complained about Officer Hutchins before. Since that night, we've been working to make sure that never happens again. She outlined the changes that had been implemented. Every officer now had to have their body camera on during any public interaction, with severe penalties for turning them off. A civilian oversight board had been established to review complaints independently. Training had been completely overhauled, with a focus on de-escalation and recognizing implicit bias, and most importantly, any officer with multiple complaints would face immediate review by a panel that included community members, not just other officers. We've also reviewed every officer's complaint history, Chief Brennan continued. 2 officers have been terminated. 3 are on probation, and we've changed our hiring practices to include more thorough background checks, including social media reviews and psychological evaluations specifically designed to identify officers who might be unsuited for this work. Rodriguez spoke briefly, her voice quiet but steady. The hardest thing I've ever done was calling for help that night. I was afraid of being seen as disloyal, afraid of damaging my career. But I'd be more afraid of looking in the mirror and knowing I'd stood by while someone was hurt. I hope other officers remember that our loyalty should be to doing what's right, not to protecting people who abuse their power. The press conference ended, and David found himself surrounded by people thanking him, supporting him, telling him he was brave. But he didn't feel brave. He felt tired. Tired of having to prove his humanity. Tired of being scared of the very people who were supposed to protect him. Tired of being seen as a threat just for existing. Later that afternoon, David met with Chief Brennan at a coffee shop, away from the cameras and reporters. They sat in a quiet corner. 2 law enforcement officers from different worlds trying to make sense of everything that had happened. "How are you really doing?" Chief Brennan asked. David stirred his coffee slowly. "Honestly, I still have nightmares. I still tense up when I see police cars. I still wonder what would have happened if you hadn't shown up when you did, or if Rodriguez hadn't called for help. But I'm dealing with it. Therapy helps. My family helps. And knowing that maybe something good came from this, that maybe we prevented this from happening to someone else, that helps too. The changes we've made, they're because of you," Chief Brennan said. "I wish I'd made them sooner before you had to go through this, but I'm grateful you gave me the push I needed to do what I should have done years ago." "It shouldn't take someone almost dying for departments to change," David said. "But if that's what it takes, at least let some good come from it." They talked for a while longer about the reforms, about the challenges of changing police culture, about the resistance Chief Brennan was facing from some officers who felt she was being too hard on them. But she was standing firm. The old way of doing things, the protection of bad officers at the expense of community trust, that was over in her department. A few weeks after the trial, David was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. Standing in front of hundreds of police chiefs, sheriffs, and other law enforcement leaders, he told his story. Not just the facts of what happened, but how it felt. The fear, the helplessness, the realization that all his training and experience meant nothing to an officer who'd already decided he was a threat based on nothing but appearance. "I've been a cop for 18 years, David said to the assembled officers. "I've dedicated my adult life to law enforcement. But in that moment on that road, I wasn't a fellow officer. I was just another person of color who didn't deserve basic dignity and respect in Hutchins's eyes. And the scary thing is, I had resources most people don't. I had FBI credentials. I had training in de-escalation. I had the knowledge of exactly what to say and how to move to avoid getting shot. Most people don't have that. Most people would have panicked or argued back or made some movement that Hutchins would have used as an excuse. And they might have died for it." The room was silent. These were hardened law enforcement professionals, people who'd seen terrible things in their careers, but David's words hit home. "We can do better," David continued. "We have to do better. Because every time an officer like Hutchins is allowed to continue despite warning signs, every time a department chooses loyalty to a bad cop over accountability, we damage the relationship between police and the communities they serve.